But again, it does tap into theology, doesn't it? Do we have a theology of suffering? Do we have a theology where fundamentally God's promises that he will be with us when the storm comes, when the floods rage, not if, but when, Jesus in the Beatitudes, when you're persecuted, not if you're persecuted. But, and a lot of this, to tie this in with a therapeutic frame of mind, is that in cognitive behavioural therapy in particular, it's what we would call core beliefs, those fundamental things that we believe, then affect how we think, how we feel, how we behave. And so a core belief is, I am rubbish. That's going to affect how you think and feel and behave, that kind of stuff. It's a similar thing in church circles with Christianity, that depending on what our beliefs are, our core beliefs, more specifically our theology around lament, around suffering, around loss, around, I became a Christian so that my life would be happy all day, every day. God owns me, it's going to be a rose garden, it's all marvellous stuff. And then one day something happens and God doesn't turn up and magically, wave his magic wand over his well. What does that challenge my faith? Is my faith built upon God will answer all my prayers all the time or else? Or is it built upon this is life, that God's promised to be with us in it? He never promised that it would be easy. He never promised it wouldn't be bad. He never promised. And also, not being funny. I mean, one of the things I saw very, very early on was our grandparents were asked to fight in 2 world wars. We've been asked to stay home and wash our hands. It's that thing that it's all relative, isn't it? I've got a friend out in South Africa, lives near one of the townships. They're just waiting for it to go there because it will just it will just be the end. That's how he summed it up. But people who live a hand-to-mouth existence, I'm telling them lockdown for 12 weeks. They're not going to get furloughed. If they don't work, they don't eat. He's afraid that will all end in rioting, looting. The death rate will be much higher. For those of us over here, we have it comparatively easy. But at the same time, that's not to belittle that it is very difficult for people. And so it's getting that balance and perspective, theologically, philosophically, personally, psychologically, it ties into all of those things, doesn't it? And because we've never been through it before, we're all scrabbling to find answers and understand it and find a way through it, when there is no roadmap for it, is there?
No, there isn't. I'm just thinking there, so, we're all going through it. I think that's one of the big differences, isn't it? Because a lot of the time you can go through life thinking that everything should be okay, having a belief about God that doesn't work in a crisis, because it happens to other people. I'm always talking to guys in our church, say, why is it okay to believe in God when bad things happen to other people? Why is it harder when it happens to your friends? And why do you suddenly have to think that through when it happens to you? That because we just can carry on with life. But now we're all, it's up close for everyone. So I hear you there saying, Peter, that it's, on the one hand, we've got to validate people's real loss and suffering, but also be able to put it in perspective at the same time. So let's dig into the theology and the belief bit a bit more. I've got a friend who went to a friend's funeral, someone who sadly had committed suicide not long after one of his kids' weddings, and she went there, and when she came back, she said one of the really sad things, she met all these people she'd become a Christian with in her late teens, early 20s, was that sort of 30 years later, their anger and disappointment about life and God was the saddest thing, not the funeral, because they just all assumed they endlessly go on holiday and have amazing houses and amazing marriages and live great lives, and of course people had died, people had got ill, people got divorced, and she said, because she remembers when she became a Christian, she's actually been through a lot herself, been through cancer multiple times and had to deal with that. And she just said to me, she said, I remember being there and I'm thinking, what did you think we signed up for when we became Christians? And there's what we say we think being a Christian is, but what we actually really expect life to be about. And I think this is just forcing a lot of us, isn't it? Exactly like you said, to go, what do I really believe about God? Why should bad things not happen to me? That makes sense.
It does make sense, yes. So I was expecting.
Your question. Well, the question would be, because I know you do that. I guess I mean, you're counselling, you're doing therapy with lots of people, but when you talk to Christians in particular, do you see that realization that they go, well, yeah, I sort of knew that, but I didn't ever think it would happen to me? How do you think we get there?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's an enormous question, isn't it? How did we actually get here? I always think I had a conversation with somebody the other day, and we were talking about he'd been praying for his church. He said while he was praying, he suddenly just burst into tears, and he'd had that kind of experience, you know, when you're sort of inside your own head, but you're aware of what you're thinking. And he was aware. He was like, "I'm crying, and I don't know why I'm crying. What am I crying about?" And just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. When it was all over, he was kind of thinking about it, processing it, reflecting on it theologically, one eye on God, one eye on what's happening. How does God inform what's happened? How does what's happened inform my understanding of God? All those kind of questions. And he said the only way he could really express it was to write a poem and draw a picture, which he didn't really do, but that was all he could. That was the only way he could get it out of his head. And I think in a sense, to my mind, that's how the Bible gets written. All these things happened to the Israelites, it happened to the early Christians. They thought about it, they reflected on it theologically. You know, what does this tell us about God? What does God tell us about this? And then what they've produced is wisdom literature, narrative, poetry, psalms, letters, just the whole mix that the Bible is. But it's come out of experience, isn't it? Reflecting on it, and then all of just the whole broad landscape that the Bible is. Now, I don't know about you, but we were encouraged when we were growing up to underline key verses, you know, highlight them in our Bibles, that kind of thing when we were growing up. It would be interesting to go through people's Bibles and see whether they've highlighted, take up your cross daily, sell everything you have and give it to the poor, you know, when you're persecuted, those kind of verses. Nobody wants to read those kind of verses. On that. But the verses like, I know the plans I have for you, all that kind of, all the good stuff. So it's that question of, is that because it's being preached from the pulpit? And I know you're very interested in church and culture, you know, the consumer church. I go to a church because it's there to meet my needs. And does this church meet my needs? If it doesn't, I'll go to another one. Does that put pressure on pastors to preach a kind of, you know, to preach that kind of gospel of, you know, come to us and it'll all be lovely. You know, if you stood up on a Sunday for the next 6 weeks and just preached, you know, it's all going to be suffering. It's all going to be lament. It's all going to be grief and loss. But don't worry, God loves you. He'll be with you in it. You know, how many people would leave your church? How many people would that draw to your church? And I think partly there's that pressure for people who run church. I don't run a church, so it doesn't, I don't know. But my guess is there's a certain pressure to be thinking, do I need to keep these people happy? Do I need to tell them what they want to hear? Versus that tension of, do I need to tell them the truth? Which is actually, life can be hard. There's that great bit in Hebrews, isn't there, where he lists all the great heroes of the faith and all the great miracles God has done to save everybody. And then sort of in the second half of the verse, then talks about all the people who died for the faith and were tortured and whatever. And it's that the Bible is, I think, is very balanced and very brutally realistic and honest. But that question is it being taught like that? Are we receiving it like that? Do we read it like that? What kind of books do we read? What kind of theology do we study? What kind of, you know, are we putting ourselves in an echo chamber where all we hear is all the lovely stuff bouncing back off the walls? I don't want to hear the bad news. But I think that's also reflected in real life, isn't it? It's reflected in life outside the church. I see a lot of people where, I know when we talked earlier, we talked about Viktor Frankl, who invented a therapy called logotherapy or meaning therapy, because his experience, his belief was that something like 95% of the clients he saw, their real issue was their lives lacked meaning and purpose. And if we don't think about meaning and purpose, what am I here for? Then when the bigger things happen, like we have to confront the fact that we might die in a pandemic or people we love might die in a pandemic. We don't like to talk about death, of course, you know, in our culture. The Victorians, they always talked about death because death was part of life, but they never talked about sex. In our culture, all we talk about is sex, but we don't want to talk about death. And so we're not really prepared, I think, culturally to have those kind of conversations anyway. And so when something like the pandemic comes and we are confronted with our own mortality, well, we're not equipped to do that. But I think, I mean, you know, where did that come from and why? I think That's
Yeah.
a huge conversation. That's way beyond my remit.
Yeah, for me, it's a perfect storm. A post Second World War extended period of time where everyone expects and tells the next generation you'll more and have more, and life expectancy increases and lifestyles, just things that our grandparents could never have imagined, and then that just becomes the norm. And I think we just don't have a theology of suffering as individuals. Even if our churches teach it, we live in a world that tells no, you can avoid all of this. I think a lot of Christians actually know their Bibles, and they know that suffering is supposed to be a normal part of Christian life. I think a lot of people have just managed to avoid it. My daughter said something. Probably shouldn't quote her, should I? Don't worry, she'll never watch this. She said, her generation. Yeah, she's an older millennial, and she said, "Dad, my generation, some of them have never really suffered anything." And I go, I mean, that's her assessment of it. Not, of course, they've got broken hearts and relationships and identity things, but not been through a war and not had even the credit crunch pass them by because they were too young. It's like, just that sort of psychological disturbance she's noticed with their friends. Like they've, been looked after, been in nice houses, had good lives, in a way that was unimaginable for most people in history. So I think even if churches teach about suffering, it never actually hits the rubber never hits the road until something really bad happens in life. And you and I know, you're a therapist, I'm a pastor. Eventually, something in life catches up with you and happens to you, and then that's usually when people realize they're not ready for it. It's like, well, I sort of knew it was going to happen, but I didn't expect it to happen.
Yeah, exactly. I think it breeds that sense of, I mean, you were talking about in culture, people are told we'll have more than our parents and our kids will have more than us and life will be better. But of course, the evidence is, in many ways, that is true. I know the stuff that I've had compared to the life that my parents lived, and looking at, I've got two boys, both in their 20s, the life that they're leading or had been up until, a couple of months ago, that, there has been that progress, there has been that stuff. But I do also wonder, I don't know what the answer is, but I know with Facebook, the internet, social media in general, we are more connected to more people around the world, and yet at the same time we are more insulated, more isolated, more detached from other people. We all know 2/3 of the world's population goes to bed hungry, but it doesn't have any kind of emotional tag to it. That's just another thing on my news feed. I read that, and then 5 seconds later I'm reading something else, and 5 seconds later I'm reading something else. So whether that's all part and parcel of it, how it goes. But like you say, even in churches where it is a good, well-rounded gospel is preached, there's no guarantee that the message gets through, and and people are ready for it. But when it happens,
yeah, so important one. Yeah, and maybe at this time, an opportunity for us to go through and think through a theology of suffering and have it become part of our faith, and see that it was normal in the Bible and normal for Christians in history, that Christianity flourished in the face of much worse things than we're going through now, and that the sign that God was involved in your life was not living a long life and having lots of money and retiring by the sea.